When a coworker doesn't respect the boundaries you've set, it can feel confusing, frustrating, and deeply unsettling, especially when you've done everything you were taught to do. You've said it clearly, you've been professional, you've stayed calm, you've said no, you've clarified expectations, you've followed up politely, and yet the behavior continues. The interruptions keep happening, deadlines are ignored, emotional labor is still expected. Your time and energy are treated as optional. If this sounds familiar, I want to say this clearly. This is not a failure on your part. Research shows that boundary violations at work are not simply communication issues. They are often tied to power dynamics, role expectations, and stress physiology, and understanding that changes how we respond. Let's talk about why this happens, why it's so stressful, and what actually helps without abandoning yourself. First, let's talk about why some coworkers ignore boundaries, even when they're clear. One of the biggest reasons is power. Organizational psychology research shows that people in dominant or informal power positions are more likely to test limits, especially when they perceive someone as cooperative, conscientious, or emotionally attuned. In other words, boundaries are often pushed not because they weren't heard, but because the other person believes they can push them. This is particularly common for women and physicians, who are often socialized to be dependable, helpful, and available. These traits are strengths, but in certain environments, they invite overreach. Another reason boundaries get ignored is how they're delivered. Studies on assertiveness show that boundaries wrapped in excessive softening language, things like just checking, if it's okay, or I'm sorry, but are more likely to be dismissed, not because they're unclear, but because they don't signal firmness. Warmth without clarity is often interpreted as negotiable. And then there's the toll of repetition. Neuroscience research on emotional suppression and cognitive load shows that when someone repeatedly has to monitor, re explain, or defend a boundary, it consumes working memory and increases stress hormones like cortisol. That's why these situations feel exhausting even when the violation seems small. Your nervous system is working overtime to stay regulated. Over time, unrespected boundaries come at a real cost. Research links ongoing boundary violations to increased burnout, emotional exhaustion, reduced job satisfaction, higher rumination, sleep disturbance, and a gradual erosion of self-trust. Many high-achieving professionals start asking themselves, am I being too rigid, or should I just let this go? This is especially dangerous for people who default to self-correction instead of external accountability. So what actually helps when a boundary isn't respected? The first shift is moving from explanation to reinforcement. Explaining why your boundary exists can be helpful once, but repeating it often signals that the boundary is still up for discussion. Instead, you reinforce it. Here are examples of what that sounds like. As I mentioned before, I'm not available after 6 p.m. That doesn't work for me. I'll respond during business hours. I won't be able to take that on. No long justification, no apology, just consistency. Behavioral psychology shows that consistency, not emotional intensity, is what teaches others how to treat us. The second strategy is naming the behavior, not the person. Conflict resolution research shows that labeling behavior reduces defensiveness more than labeling character. So instead of saying, you keep ignoring my boundaries, you say, I've noticed this request continues after I've said no. Or, we've discussed my availability and this keeps coming up. This keeps the focus on facts, not personality. The third piece is introducing structural boundaries, not just verbal ones. Research shows that boundaries are more effective when supported by systems. That might look like calendar blocks, delayed email responses, clear task ownership, or written follow-ups after conversations. For example, after a meeting, you might say, just to confirm, I'm responsible for X and Y will be handled by you. Environmental cues reduce reliance on willpower and emotional labor. And the fourth piece is listening to your body. If you feel tension, dread, or shutdown when interacting with someone, your nervous system is signaling a boundary violation, even if your mind is trying to rationalize it. Somatic research reminds us that boundaries aren't just cognitive, they're physiological. Your body often knows before your brain gives you permission to act. Now, What happens when the pattern continues? If a coworker repeatedly ignores boundaries after they've been clearly reinforced, the issue is no longer communication, it's respect. At that point, evidence supports documenting examples, looping in leadership, clarifying role expectations formally, reducing exposure where possible, and reassessing whether the environment supports healthy work. Boundaries are not about controlling other people. They are about protecting your capacity, clarity, and well being. And I want to leave you with this reframe. You are not difficult for maintaining boundaries. You are not too sensitive for feeling impacted. And you are not obligated to keep explaining what has already been stated. Healthy workplaces don't require constant self defense. Your boundaries are not the problem. The problem is when they are ignored and you are expected to absorb the cost. And choosing not to absorb that cost anymore is not selfish. Make sure to like, subscribe, and grab my free leadership workbook, 5 Steps to Communicate with Calm, Clarity, and Confidence at powerofpeacefulness.com. Until next time, take a deep breath. Embrace the present moment and keep walking your path to peace.